And I want to give us a little bit of kind of additional background and kind of context for what's happening in the United States. So for one thing is that Britain was going through its own abolition movement. And I think this is important because the United States and Britain have a lot of kind of connections and similarities, especially because of the same, language, that there's a lot of people kind of moving back and forth and ideas pass very easily because there's no need for translation. And so the British abolition movement is something that definitely provides some support for the American abolition movement. And we could see British abolition starting off, not even all that purposefully, with the Somerset decision in 1773. So in the Somerset decision, an enslaved man who was in Britain sued for his freedom. Now, Britain had quite a lot of the British colonies, a lot of those small islands in the Caribbean, but they had never really brought slavery home to the British Isles. Yes, there were small numbers of enslaved people. Equiano is one of them who spends time in Britain as a slave, but there was not the need for labor like there was for that, the cheap labor of enslaved people that's used in the especially sugar plantations in the colonies. That wasn't really necessary in Britain because Britain already had a large population. It already had kind of the poor working classes who were being kind of used and abused for their labor. So you don't have large numbers of enslaved people brought over. And that means that while there were all these laws and regulations passed in the colonies to deal with slavery, much like we saw them being passed in the North American colonies that would become the United States, that started to lay the foundations and then to create this idea of slavery, that isn't happening in Britain under the British legal system there in the British Isles. So when this enslaved man sues for his freedom, the judge actually tries to get his master to settle out of court because he doesn't want to make this decision because he knows that this legal decision will have larger consequences than just this particular case. But the judge ends up being kind of forced to make this ruling that slavery is illegal in Britain. There was never a law passed that said people could be enslaved in Britain. And so because of the Somerset decision, slavery no longer exists there within the British Isles. This doesn't affect the colonies, but people in the colonies feel it will. And this is 1773, it's before the American Revolution. Some of those colonists in what will become the United States, especially in those southern colonies, are very concerned. It's actually the reason why some of them joined the American Revolution is they want the freedom to be able to keep enslaving people, and they're worried they won't be able to do that if under British control. They're worried the Somerset decision is the first step in that direction. And it kind of is, although it will take a while to grow from there. In 1807, there's the Slave Trade Act, which outlaws the slave trade. It doesn't outlaw slavery in the colonies, outlaws the slave trade. So no more bringing in enslaved people from Africa. Remember, the United States passes its own law outlawing the transatlantic slave trade in 1808. So in that stance, kind of the United States and Britain are very level. But then there's the Baptist War in Jamaica in 1831. This is a really huge slave rebellion that had quite a lot of deaths and destruction of property. And the British government created this kind of series of inquiries looking into how did this rebellion happen? Why did these people rebel? How did it get this far? And it really uncovers a lot of the just horrific evils of slavery for the British people. Because, like I said, a lot of the British people back home in the British Isles, they're not having anything to do really directly with slavery. They know it exists. They know that there's those slave plantations. There's some British folks who are traveling back and forth. But especially by 1831, the transatlantic slave trade is done, so you don't have the numbers of sailors who are involved in that anymore. And so there's this awareness of slavery, but not at all an awareness of really the evils and the violence and the horrors of slavery. And as people start seeing, okay, this is why those enslaved people in Jamaica were rebelling, they're sympathizing with them. They're saying, yeah, they maybe had a reason to rebel. That is really horrible the way they were being treated. So by 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act is passed, and this abolishes slavery throughout the British Empire. It does it by compensating the enslavers. So the people, the slave masters who are now losing their enslaved property because they can't hold them as slaves anymore, got a compensation from the government. It wasn't the full cost, but it was seen as somewhat kind of appropriate. The government can't just steal property from people. And it's one of the ways that Britain is able to kind of get it through. This is something some people talked about doing in the United States, but it really wasn't going to work well in the United States. There's a larger population. There's 4 million enslaved people in the United States by the outbreak of the Civil War. And their value was huge. We'll get into this a little bit later, but the value of enslaved people at the eve of the Civil War was more than the value of U.S. banking, manufacturing, and transportation combined. The only thing more valuable in the United States was the actual land itself. So this is one of the reasons compensation really doesn't work in terms of American abolition, and many of the abolitionists were very opposed to it because slavery was evil. They wanted to end slavery. The enslavers, right, the masters, have been benefiting off this horrifically coercive system and accumulating a lot of wealth from it. And a lot of the abolitionists said they shouldn't get any more wealth. If anything, they should have their wealth taken from them because they've only acquired it through these evils. Here we have a map that's looking at the abolition of slavery in the Americas. You can see, starting with the kind of blues, going to the greens, to yellows, to orange, to red, is the scale of when places are abolishing slavery. So you can see like Massachusetts is fairly kind of early on, even before Massachusetts. We have Vermont, we have the Northwestern territory out here. You have Canada, parts of Canada getting rid of slavery in 1819 and 1829, and then quite a lot of places getting rid of slavery in 1833. We'll have a zoom in here and you'll be able to see how many. Those are all the British colonies that slavery ends. Mexico got rid of slavery in 1829. This is actually one of the reasons for the Texas Revolution. Remember, Texas was part of Mexico. Lots of Americans went in there. They agreed to be Mexican, to follow Mexican laws, be part of the Mexican nation. And then Mexico was getting rid of slavery, and the people in Texas were not happy about that. They wanted to be able to keep their slaves. They wanted to be able to keep enslaving people. And so they staged the Texas Revolution so that they would again be free to enslave people. But you can kind of notice just how late in the game the United States is in 1865 for ending slavery. There's a few that are after that. Cuba is 1886, Puerto Rico is 1873, Brazil 1888 is the latest. There's Paraguay in 1869, Suriname in 1863, but that's it. So the United States is kind of late. We can't really use the excuse that, well, everyone was enslaving people. So, it just took us, the whole world, it took all of people, to figure out that slavery was wrong. We can't say they were just men of their times, because then why weren't we ending slavery in the 1830s when a lot of other places were? Or the 1850s with Venezuela and Peru and Ecuador and Colombia and Panama and Argentina. And if we zoom in here, we can see the scale as well. You can see a lot of the like green here are all 1833. Those are the British islands, some of the French islands as well. So you can see kind of the United States is a bit delayed, let's say, in terms of ending slavery. Now, the abolition movement, this movement to end slavery, is something that was growing from early on. All the way back in 1775, we have the Society for the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage. This then becomes the 1784 Pennsylvania Abolition Society, which was housed in Philadelphia. In 1785, there's the New York Manumission Society. In 1789, there is the Maryland Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery and the Relief of Free Negroes and Others Unlawfully Held in Bondage. In 1790, the Quakers, also known more formally as the Religious Society of Friends, by 1790, they had outlawed slavery, and so you could not be a Quaker and continue to be enslaving people. In 1831, the New England Anti-Slavery Society, which was based in Massachusetts, was formed. Out of that came the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, based in Boston. In 1833, there's the larger, this was to be more of an umbrella kind of group, American Anti-Slavery Society. This was created by William Lloyd Garrison and Arthur Tappan, two really important white abolitionists. And in 1846, there's the American Missionary Association in New York. So you can see how these different societies are kind of growing, developing over time, that there's this movement that is growing in the United States. Now, William Lloyd Garrison is a white abolitionist, but I want to give him just a little bit of attention because he is fairly important. He joined the anti-slavery movement at the age of 25 when he became the co-editor of the Genius of Universal Emancipation. He gets jailed in Maryland in 1830 for 7 weeks for stuff that he said in that newspaper about a slave trader. And so he leaves Maryland after that. He goes up to Boston. He thinks he'll have a bit more freedom and a bit more of a welcoming audience in Boston, which is a pretty fair kind of assumption. There is much more of an abolitionist movement there in Massachusetts and in Boston especially. This is where he starts the Liberator. This is from the first edition of the Liberator, and I really love his language here. He says, "I am aware that many object to the severity of my language. But is there not cause for severity? I will be harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. On this subject I do not wish to think, or speak, or write with moderation. No, no. Tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hands of the ravisher. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her babe from the fire into which it has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch. And I will be heard. The apathy of the people is enough to make every statue leap from its pedestal and to hasten the resurrection of the dead." So, Garrison was very much that immediate abolitionist. Slavery is evil, it is inexcusable, and it must end now. He's not greeted with much love by the South. Georgia actually offers $5,000 for anyone who will bring him back to their state for a trial. There's 6 Mississippi slaveholders who offer $20,000 for anyone who would deliver Garrison to them. I think it's up to our imagination what they plan to do to Garrison once they got him. Garrison is the one who kind of discovers Frederick Douglass. Douglass comes to a meeting and stands up at the end and starts to tell his story. And as soon as Garrison hears him, he's like, "This guy is amazing. He's eloquent. He's great at telling the story. It's moving. This is the way to capture the attention of our audience, to get more people to the cause of abolition, because this is the story of someone who has actually been enslaved, right? The first-hand account is so powerful." So Garrison helps Douglass kind of get started, although they do have a little bit of a break later on. Some kind of differences of opinions. But Garrison is really kind of important. He also is very much involved within the Black community. He listens to people in the Black community. Some of these white abolitionists could sometimes be a bit patronizing, kind of have this assumption that they know better. For example, Garrison did briefly support the idea of Black colonization that would be sending freed people over to Africa into these kind of Black colonies, right? Send them back to Africa. When Black people were telling him, "Well, no, we've lived here for generations. We don't speak the languages of Africa. We don't know where in Africa we're from. We don't want to go anywhere. We want to be free here." He says, "Well, okay, you must know best. This is your lives. And if you don't want to go, then you shouldn't have to go." And not all white abolitionists were always quite as willing to listen to African Americans, and sometimes felt like they kind of knew best. Sarah and Angelina Grimke are also really interesting. They grew up in a very, very wealthy South Carolina family, surrounded by slaves, surrounded by wealth, right? They were the kind of white people who really benefit from slavery. But Angelina felt that it was evil. At first, not quite so much that she's seeing an equality with Black folks, but she sees it as something that is bad for white people to be enslaving others, that it leads to kind of corruption and sexual immorality and abuse, and that it's kind of bad for white folks. Later on, she'll become much more kind of egalitarian, and she considers her fellow black kind of abolitionists as fellow abolitionists, right, as equals. She invites them to her wedding. It's actually a scandal because when she gets married, and she's marrying a white guy, but when she gets married, there are black and white people in the audience, and there's a black and white pastor marrying them, and that was considered way over the top in terms of scandal. But in 1835, she writes a letter to Garrison, kind of talking about some of her experiences, what she's seen as the evils of slavery. And Garrison's like, this is a woman who has grown up in slavery. She has seen it, right? That she has grown up side by side. She was raised by black slaves. I mean, she's living in a family where she and her family sit down at the dinner table, and they each have a slave who stands behind them to, like, pass the pepper shaker or get them a fresh glass of water. It's like obscene wealth. And she's condemning slavery. So Garrison publishes the letter. He doesn't have permission to do this. And it catapults Angelina into kind of the spotlight. She and her older sister Sarah end up leaving the family. They're no longer welcome there. And start working in abolitionist circles. They do these parlor meetings at first, and they do start to speak to more groups of men and women. They're also, though, very much advocates of equal rights. We can see Sarah talking about men and women are being created equal. Angelina also was trying to appeal to other Christian women in the South. Right? This is an appeal to Christian women of the South, and saying, that we need to follow the teachings of Jesus and follow the golden rule, and those kinds of things, to try to get Southerners to also condemn slavery. They're not super successful in that, but they are very popular in the Northern abolitionist circles. One of the pieces that I'm having you read for this week is by Frederick Douglass. So you've already read his whole long narrative. I'm having you read just a relatively short speech that he gave on the 4th of July that's really powerful and moving. And, this is the kind of thing that you can see the real strength of these black abolitionists, to be able to give some of that real insight into slavery and really be holding the United States and the American people kind of accountable for their hypocrisies, right? So how dare you be celebrating, the 4th of July and independence, freedom, and liberty when none of that has been granted to all of the enslaved people in the United States. And so this is one of Douglas's more kind of famous speeches, in which he's condemning slavery.